An 8-year-old gets a very strange inheritance.
When my dad died, everyone was heartbroken.
But what does a boy do with a winery?
The funniest thing is when I would tell my friends' parents, and they would totally freak out.
Talk about getting your feet wet in a new business.
Drinking it's grape juice.
That is really good.
But how does the family keep it from dying on the vine?
I didn't know anything about wine, except that I like to drink it.
So what's the heir going to do when he grows up?
I'm trying to prove that I'm not the owner's kid who just gets handed these things.
I'm Jamie Colby, and today I'm traveling through the Willamette Valley of Oregon, wine country. In fact, this area is home to around 400 wineries. So you can probably guess what this episode of Strange Inheritance is all about. But it's one that was passed down far too soon and to a most improbable heir.
My name is Pascal Brooks. When I was 8 years old, I inherited something that is pretty special and still blows my mind.
Thank you so much for having me, Pascal. Wow, it is an honor to meet you. How unusual is it for somebody your age to be in charge of all this?
I'm not the one that does the work. I simply own it.
The 18-year-old may own this winery, but he can't legally drink its product. However, he does pitch in every so often to get a good feel for his strange inheritance. Nice to see you helping out the family winery. Very nice. The story of how Pascal became the world's youngest owner of a winery begins with his father, Jimmy Brooks. Janie Hoyk is Pascal's aunt. She and Pascal's dad, Jimmy, grew up in Portland.
As we got older and got out of high school, we both took very, very different paths.
Janie zips through a degree in accounting, while Jimmy goes on the 5-year plan, finally gets his BA, but then decides to find himself by traveling through Europe.
So he moved over there, took a few jobs, would go spend his money traveling and find another job.
For one job, Jimmy harvests grapes in the Beaujolais region of France. At another, he teaches English as a second language in Krakow, Poland, a position he takes after setting eyes on 20-year-old waitress Bożena Katuba. Romance leads to marriage in September 1995. Soon, baby Pascal arrives, and Jimmy moves his young family back to Portland.
I remember the first time when we drove from the airport into Portland. I've never seen anything like that. This beautiful river and then the lights.
Jimmy gets a gig as a vineyard manager and in his spare time starts his own brand of wine. He enlists the help of a friend, Chris Williams, who until that point was not a winemaker, but a motorcycle mechanic.
Jimmy's whole goal was to be able to make wines that people enjoyed, make wines that we enjoyed.
But while Jimmy's focused on his career, his marriage to Bożena turns bitter. In 2000, they divorce. They agree that Pascal will spend every other weekend with his dad. On many a Saturday, Jimmy takes Pascal to work.
Your dad tried to pull you into this as a kid, right? He wanted you around?
Whenever I was with him, it was more for the fact that I was with him and he was happy that I was there.
What do you remember about your dad?
I remember waking up and it'd be cold and early and we'd get into his dilapidated truck and we'd stop for coffee and a cinnamon roll early in the morning.
By 2001, Jimmy is head winemaker for one winery, and as a perk, he's allowed to make thousands of cases of his own Brooks wine on the side. Jimmy starts buying grapes from other farmers, then leases a 20-acre plot planted with old vines. He hopes to buy it one day. Jimmy becomes a pioneer in Oregon of a farming method he learned in France called biodynamics. It uses no chemicals or additives, but focuses on soil fertility and even the phases of the moon.
So the fruit comes in.
Chris gives me a little backstage tour and shows me how they make their Pinot Noir. They're beautiful grapes.
Yeah,
May I taste one?
Of course. So nice and ripe, sweet, but not too sweet.
Amazing.
The idea behind Pinot is to have whole berries, which lets the fermentation happen inside the berry.
This is a pretty big bucket of grapes. How many bottles of wine am I looking at?
About 120 gallons, which would be roughly 50 cases.
By December 2003, Jimmy's wines are getting noticed throughout Oregon and beyond. He tells the Atlantic Monthly magazine he hopes that one day his winery will be his son's inheritance.
He stated in that very clearly that he wanted his winery to be a legacy for Pascal.
Then one Saturday morning in September 2004, Jimmy is arguing with his ex-wife about whose turn it is to be with Pascal. After that call, Jimmy makes another one to his girlfriend.
He was on the phone with his girlfriend when he mentioned that his chest was hurting and could she come over.
Before Jimmy's girlfriend can arrive, Jimmy dies of an aortic aneurysm. He's 38 years old. Pascal is 8.
I think when my dad died, everyone was heartbroken. Kids soak up the atmosphere. And it wasn't that I readily wanted to do that, but you just don't know how to rationalize it.
Jimmy's sister Janie is at home in Northern California with her husband and 2 young children when she gets the call. She immediately begins the long trek up to Oregon. She arrives to find a crowd of people she barely knows in her brother's house. What happens next will not only turn Janie's life upside down, but determine whether her nephew's strange inheritance is anything but a crop of grapes about to wither on the vine.
One of the few things you can do for someone who's died is help their family, take care of their unfinished business.
That's next. And later?
How deep is it?
About up to your knees.
You know, I failed gymnastics. Ah, ooh.
But first, our strange inheritance quiz question. Why do some winemakers crush their grapes with their feet? Is it because it's the cheapest way? It gives the wine a nice bouquet. Or for flavor? The answer in a moment. So what's the reason some winemakers crush their grapes with their feet? It's C, flavor. The human foot is said to be ideally suited to crushing grapes without breaking open the grape seeds that give wine a bitter taste.
It's September 2004, the middle of harvest season for Oregon winemakers. This year, however, shock permeates this beautiful landscape after up-and-coming winemaker Jimmy Brooks dies unexpectedly. The 38-year-old leaves behind a wine label that's won critical acclaim, and his only heir, an 8-year-old son, Pascal. There are also loose ends. Jimmy has no will and 0 savings. He's left Pascal's mom, Bojana, with few options.
He was a known winemaker, but when Pascal inherited the winery, it was more like a label, really not much behind it. I said the only thing I can try is to raise Pascal.
But there's another pressing issue. Jimmy left several tons of grapes still on the vine. His sister Janie arrives in Oregon to settle his affairs.
What did the other growers tell you about the importance of Jimmy's work continuing?
He was blazing new trails, and they didn't want to see the brand go away. And they all stepped up and offered to take his fruit that year and make his wine for free if I would help him on the business side.
Tad Seastead is one of those other growers and a longtime friend of Jimmy's.
One of the few things you can do for someone who's died is help their family, take care of their unfinished business. Jimmy had told me, at least a handful of times, he didn't feel like he had much of a legacy for Pascal besides his winery.
So Tad and the other growers harvest Jimmy's crop, make it into wine, and keep Brooks Winery alive. And Janie begins the legal paperwork of transferring ownership of Brooks Winery to her nephew, Pascal. She agrees to be his financial guardian and manager of the winery without pay, but there's one big problem.
I didn't know anything about wine at all, except that I like to drink it.
So Janie bones up on viticulture, the study of grapes for winemaking. And she asked Chris Williams to be head winemaker.
Was it important to you to talk him into taking the role?
He was the only one that had worked for Jimmy, and that's where he had learned everything he knew about making wine.
This sounds like a recipe for disaster. An 8-year-old kid and his accountant aunt get together with a former motorcycle mechanic to make wine? But let me sit down and taste that Pinot before passing judgment.
So, aerate? Why?
It blends oxygen with the wine, and it brings out more of the aromatics.
Smell because?
It gives your senses a feeling of what you're actually going to get.
Wow, I'm speechless. Normally I would come up with tobacco and wood tree and mold, but in a good way, but it's none of those things.
Okay, delicious wine. Not a bad start. But selling wine is a hyper-competitive business, and I've learned getting those first bottles sold while you're making your next vintage can require big bucks.
All of this doesn't come cheap.
And trying to keep the demand side equivalent to our supply was a big learning curve for me.
So while Janie goes on the road to entice distributors, Pascal trolleys off to grade school, able to brag about being the youngest winery owner in the world.
I think the funniest thing with that is when I would tell my friends' parents, and they would totally freak out.
Soon, several stores in the high-end supermarket chain Whole Foods agree to stock Brooks wines, as do other retailers in 9 states and Japan. On a roll in 2005, Janie renegotiates a lease for the same vineyard where Jimmy had been growing his grapes. She also develops a 2,500 square foot sales and tasting room in Amity, Oregon, in anticipation of exponential growth, which doesn't happen.
It did get to a point where I had to really get a hold of how to add more markets so that we could sell more wine.
Faced with losing momentum and losing her brother's only legacy to his son, Janie searches for her next move. That is, until affairs of state intervene.
Lo and behold, I got a phone call from the White House.
That and the future of Brooks Wine's young heir next on Strange Inheritance.
Here's another quiz question for you. Which of these states produces the most wine? Texas, Idaho, or Pennsylvania? The answer when we return. So, which of these states produces the most wine? The answer is C. Pennsylvania is America's 5th biggest wine-producing state, behind California, New York, Washington, and Oregon.
It's 2009, and 13-year-old Pascal Brooks remains the world's youngest winery owner, following the untimely death of his father, Jimmy Brooks. His aunt, Janie Hoyt, volunteered to oversee Brooks Wines until its young heir comes of age. But she's struggling to keep her brother's legacy afloat. That is, until she gets a phone call from a wine steward in Chicago.
He called me and told me he was catering a dinner and wanted to serve our Riesling. And lo and behold, the next day I got a phone call and an email from the White House.
Brooks' 2006 Ara Riesling is selected for President Barack Obama's first state dinner, honoring the Prime Minister of India.
When the White House calls and places an order for wine for a state dinner, does that wine sell out?
Well, in this case, because there was so much hype around it being his first dinner, it made it even more sought after.
Even though Brooks Wines is now riding high, things aren't going as well for Pascal.
I think there's the age when their dad should be at their games and they know that they will never get that. I think that was the most difficult time for Pascal.
Add to that, Pascal and his mom have relocated across the country from Portland to Pittsburgh so that she could take a new job.
When I left Oregon, I was heartbroken. I think for me, I was still in shock.
Pascal spends summers in Oregon, but the trips remind him of what's missing in his life, his father.
What is it like to not be able to turn to your dad and say, hey, Dad,
The older you get, you realize there's a shadow of something that should be there, and so you're constantly clinging for something like that.
During his summer visits, Pascal gets hands-on experience in the winery he owns.
Does it bring you any comfort then to have this be a part of your life?
It's more for the fact of making those people's lives easier and trying to prove that I'm not the owner's kid who just gets handed these things.
It's finally time for me to get some hands-on experience of my own. Well, not hands-on, but feet-on. It's the time-honored practice of stomping grapes.
Jamie, come on in. Join me.
All right, where's my stunt double when I need her?
How deep is it?
About up to your knees.
You know, I failed gymnastics. Ah, ooh.
Feels good.
Grapes feel good. I hear they're anti-aging. So what are we doing exactly?
Want a little bit of separation before we make it into rosé. We're separating the berry itself from its juice.
Wow, what an awesome feeling. They still make wine this way?
Some places they do. Drink it, it's grape juice.
Whoa.
It's good, isn't it?
That is really good.
Now Brooks has become too big to make its wine this way. You might say it's on more solid footing. They're making Pinot Noirs and Rieslings in Jimmy's style. At least 12,000 cases a year, and now selling in 14 states, Japan and the UK.
We have a great distribution network right now, so plenty of demand for our product throughout the country, and I feel like we're really solid and really stable.
Solid enough for Janie to realize it's time for a big step. A plot of land that was very special to her brother comes up for sale, a 20-acre vineyard he had always wanted to buy.
We thought, okay, it's time for us to acquire the vineyard.
But what about the 18-year-old owner of Brooks Winery? What does any of this mean for him and his strange inheritance?
What if you go to college and you decide, I want to be an architect?
That's next.
Now back to Strange Inheritance.
2014 marks the 10th anniversary of Jimmy Brooks' death. A winemaker whose passion and innovative techniques live on through the dedication of his sister Janie, his best friend Chris, and his only child Pascal, now 18 years old and the heir to this strange inheritance. Since Jimmy died in 2004, Janie has been running the business and growing it by leaps and bounds.
We grew from Jimmy making 2,500 cases, and now we make between 12,000 and 14,000, which is really the sweet spot in terms of keeping our wines affordable.
Janie knew that when her brother started the winery, he wanted it to have a permanent vineyard on a special plot of land, the one he was leasing when he grew his last crop of grapes in 2004. When it comes up for sale, Brooks Wines is not able to swing the deal by itself. But Aunt Janie decides now is the time.
Did you have to put any of your own money in?
Yeah, my husband and I personally own the vineyard, then Pascal leases it from us.
In April 2014, the Brooks Winery you see here today broke ground. The business is still 100% owned by Pascal. It's no longer the fledgling label his father left behind, but a big enterprise with long-term commitments. So how does all of that sit with a young man headed off to college? Will he follow in his dad's footsteps?
What if you go to college and you decide, I want to be an architect?
And that's what I'm gonna do. I'll still own it, but I'll be an architect.
Before Pascal heads off, Janie throws a party to celebrate the new winery and their loving memory of Jimmy Brooks.
So that was your dad's Europe backpack. And this is a draft book, a collection of stories and pictures from your dad's friends. I didn't have time to finish it, but
One of my favorite things he left me was his library. I've gone through and found his notes scrawled in the margins or found something that he says there. It's like having a conversation with him.
I think he's right now at this very good point in his life when he is looking forward to honor his dad's memory, but he is so set on making his own path, and that is exactly like his dad.
He's my rainbow. The day we broke ground here, there was a double rainbow over the vineyard. I'm not a super spiritual person that way, but I do feel when things might need to be a little bit brighter, something good will happen, and I attribute that to him.
The Brooks Wines label comes from a tattoo that Jimmy had on his left arm. It's the mythical serpent known as Ouroboros, swallowing its own tail. In cultures around the world, it represents the never-ending cycle of life, death, and renewal. When he chose it, Jimmy could not have known just how appropriate a symbol it would become for the winery that he founded, that his sister rescued and built into a success, and that his son Pascal has inherited. And now Pascal tells me he's going to get that same tattoo. So, here's to all that. I'm Jamie Colby for Strange Inheritance. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, you can't take it with you.
Do you have a strange inheritance story you'd like to share with us? We'd love to hear it. Send me an email or go to our website, strangeinheritance.com.